Hello and welcome to this 17th lecture of our course Blockchain and its applications. Also, this is the 5th and final lecture on the topic of the elements, basic structural elements of blockchain, how it works, the basic concepts. And as we have said that we are focusing on Bitcoin, but similar concepts are also used by other blockchains with certain changes in the protocols. The concepts that we plan to cover in today's lecture are as follows, that we will see how this Bitcoin network had started and how coins were created, how the block reward that we said that the reward you get for generating new blocks that have changed with time and the reason for doing it, and then that how double spending is handled, the problem that otherwise is of concern, and also we will see that how payment can be made using Bitcoin in real life and also its anonymity. And finally, we touch upon the topic of what we know as Bitcoin exchanges, which most of you have heard, seen various advertisements on those. So, we will touch upon those topics also. The keywords for today's lecture are as follows: the block reward, what it means, what is this double spending problem that we talked about, then anonymity, and then of course, we talk about Bitcoin exchange as already mentioned. So, if we see the generation of the coin, so it is coin, it is a currency, means there should be some way of so called minting the coins, generation of the coins. Like any other currency we see in practice, we have the mints which mint the coins, and also we have these notes printed. So, that is how new such coins or notes or currencies are entered into the system, and also maybe as they become old they are removed from the system, and till they are in circulation actually they change hands, right. I buy something, I hand over say a 100 rupee note, and then I get the item or I get some service, and then it goes to the recipient who in turn uses it, and then again goes to somebody else, and this is how it circulates in the economy. So, also it means that you cannot keep on adding more such currencies in the entire economy. You have to have a controlled supply, otherwise there will be this what is called inflation. So, even in Bitcoin network also it is to be controlled. So, we have this way of controlling the supply. So, any maliciously generated currency also needs to be rejected. So, just as there are counterfeit notes and coins may be in real currency, it is important that there is a way to ensure that such these counterfeit bitcoins are also not added to the network. And we have seen that different such nodes actually validate the transactions that through those input output scripts, so that only valid use of these currencies can actually take place. So, that is like the law enforcement agencies which carry out raids for checking that there are no such counterfeit currencies being somewhat generated or printed and then pushed into the entire economy. Now, bitcoins are generated during the mining. So, let us see what we mean by that. So, if you look at this example, I am just picking up one of these most recent these blocks, which is 704495, and as you can see I am doing it in real time. So, this was generated 21 minutes 8 seconds ago. So, I click on that, and then if we see this particular block, so if you see this particular block, it has got this header and it has got different such transactions here. You can see a lot of such transactions, and then also what we see here is that you see this block reward written here. Okay. So, if you see this block reward written here, it says 6.25 BTC. So, that means that generation of the block gave this miner a reward of 6.25 Bitcoin, and you know what is the value of 1 Bitcoin, and you can figure out how much this 6.25 Bitcoin would cost, and then you know that indeed this effort that this particular mining node is spending, it is getting repaid by this block reward as one part, and for each of the other transactions that are there. So, it gets also certain reward. So, if you look at this example, that the total reward this miner got is written here as 6.39265 etc., and then that part of that is that 6.25 it got for generating this block as part of the block reward, and then the difference it got from each of the users whose transactions were included in this block. And if you see, this is what is written here as the fee, which is shown as 0.0006 Bitcoin, and then the next one also shows something like this, and the next one shows 0.0005, and then the next one shows 0.000504, and you see that different such parties who are carrying out those transactions, they have committed to paying this much for including their transactions in the particular block. So, if you add these, I see one more which is 0.00043930 and so on. So, and these are all based on what is shown here as the number of satoshis per V byte. So, there is this notion of virtual bytes, and satoshis is a small unit of Bitcoin. So, this is what actually the different users who were carrying out those transactions have committed, and all these are now being collected by the node who has mined this particular block. Also, if you look at this example here for your understanding, that if I go to block number 0, which should be interesting to you, if I go to block number 0, which was the very first Bitcoin block that was mined by Satoshi, and if you see that it had this block reward of 50 Bitcoin. So, this is the very first block number 0, as you see here as the height of the block, which is basically the block number you can consider, and then it had got these 50 Bitcoins, and it used that 50 Bitcoins to transfer these 50 Bitcoins to somebody else, which often is identified with Halfania. So, who got these 50 Bitcoins, which was as the first and the only transaction in the very first block in the Bitcoin blockchain. So, this is for your understanding about what is this generation process, and then during the mining, each time the user discovers a new block, this extra amount of Bitcoin is generated, which the miner gets, and also gets the different commitments made by the users in terms of the satoshis per virtual bytes, and which are small amounts, but totally they add up, and the total amount of Bitcoin is now given to the miner. And then the rate of block creation is adjusted every 2016 blocks. So, that means that you see that every time this new block is created, then typically it is assumed that it will be taking roughly about 10 minutes on an average to mine a new block in Bitcoin. So, that was something said by Satoshi, and then what had Satoshi done at this time, and then the amount of computational power you have today, they are completely different. And then if it is 10 minutes was the setting, that the average time for creation of a new block, now with more powerful hardware you should be able to solve the puzzle very quickly. So, very quickly you will be able to generate the new nonce in order that the requirements for the number of leading zeros would be satisfied. So, that is why what happens with passing of time, as the different hardware become more and more efficient for mining of the blocks, the difficulty is also increased. So, now more number of leading zeros are required in generating any new block. So, if you see the first one, okay, in this one, if you look at it, if you see there are only these few on the top left, you can see that these few leading zeros, and as you have seen in today's block, of course, there are several more number of leading zeros. So, that means that with time we have been able to somehow adjust the difficulty level, so that we now have more number of leading zeros required. As you can see here, that if you consider the most recent block, you see it has got more number of leading zeros as is shown here, and which is being highlighted here for your understanding. So, that means that there should be some way that this is adjusted, and there is this adjustment for every 2016 blocks, which takes about 2 weeks to mine, you can calculate simply by 10 minutes and so on. And then this network difficulty level, as you see, which is in terms of number of leading zeros, that has changed over the years and the months, and usually it has been increasing. Only in July of 2021 there was a sudden drop, and then again you see that it is slowly increasing since July till October of 2021, and in general there is this increasing trend, and which is quite obvious, because with time these new hardware will be able to solve the puzzles more quickly, and that means that we have to increase the number of leading zeros, so that that average block mining time of 10 minutes remain fixed. And as these blocks are mined, what happens is that the amount of block reward is reduced over a period of time. And initially we saw that for block number 0, the block generation reward or the block reward was 50 bitcoins. Today, if any miner generates a new block, the miner gets only 6.25 bitcoins, and it will again be reduced further every 4 years or so. It is reduced, as we will see very soon, and then the last bitcoin will be mined estimated in 2140, and then unless this particular policy is changed. So, as is mentioned here, that number of bitcoins generated per block is said to decrease geometrically with a 50% reduction for every 210,000 blocks, or approximately, which takes about 4 years. You can roughly calculate based on 10 minutes on an average for creating a new block, and you can see for generating 210,000 such blocks, you will take roughly about 4 years. And with time, the amount of bitcoins generated per block will be reduced. That means, the block reward is being reduced, and that is to ensure that there is a control flow of bitcoins in the entire this Bitcoin, this cryptocurrency economy of Bitcoin. So, miners will get less rewards as time progresses, and the theoretical limit for total number of bitcoins is slightly less than 21 million. And then why would then the miners be interested in mining the blocks when they are getting less and less block rewards? It would mean that actually the transaction cost would be going up. Okay. So, that is what we will see in the next few years. And if you see this particular diagram, so here you can also go to this internet source, that initially you can see that this it was 50 bitcoin per block, and then it was reduced to 25 after about 4 years, and then 12.5 and so on, and now you can see that it is 6.25, and after some time in 2024 this will be reduced to 3.125, and then further reduction and so on. As we said, that finally in the year around 2140 we will end up having the last bitcoin mine, and these new bitcoins are getting generated only in the form of block rewards, and after that it will be only the existing bitcoins which are getting circulated through these transaction costs that are being committed by the users. Now, of course, we have seen that how to send payments, this we have studied before, but now to put it also in this perspective of how it is happening in the context of actual generation and transfer of bitcoin. So, Alice wants to send the bitcoins to Bob. So, Bob has sent his address to Alice, which we have seen before. Alice adds Bob's address and the amount of bitcoin to transfer in a transaction message, which you have seen. Alice signs the transaction with her private key and announces her public key for signature verification, and then broadcasts the transaction on the Bitcoin network for all to see. Now, how is double spending prevented? As we have seen, if Alice had sent these 50 bitcoins to Bob and also to maybe somebody else, as we see in the two examples here, so to Bob and to Tom maybe, and then the same bitcoin is used more than once. Now, in physical currencies, cash, if you see that if I have a 100 rupee note and I give it to you and get some service or product from you, now I cannot use the same 100 rupee note once again, because it is now with you. But then what can be done in physical currencies? It may not be so easy to stop it for digital currencies. One way was that there is a centralized bank which could also generate these digital currencies. Before we have this notion of bitcoins, which is a peer-to-peer network, we had these digital currencies, where mind it that a central sort of digital bank used to issue those digital currencies, and if I wanted to or tried or attempted to double spend it, it will always be checked against its validity by that centralized controller or the central bank, which was a so called digital bank. But then how we can do it in a decentralized network? Effectively, this is done by, as we have seen, that every transaction will get validated and the blocks will get validated. So, when multiple validation is continuing in there for that particular transaction or one transaction and the double spending transaction to appear in any block and get added to the blockchain, then what will happen is that if it gets added to the same block, it will get detected. If it gets added to two different blocks as forks, then only one of them will prevail, the other will eventually die out, as we have seen from our previous lecture. So, what happens is that it is no way that one can do double spending and get away with it. Also, you might wonder that, oh, suppose Alice first puts it in one transaction which gets added to say block number 10, and also she does it which gets added to block number 11, which are in parallel, then what would happen? So, then both of the recipients, say maybe Bob and Carol, might be able to use the those 10 bitcoins they received from Alice, and they also may provide their service back to Alice. Then what happens is that actually this cannot be done unless those transactions have been added to a certain minimum number of blocks, then only the amount that Alice was getting, that would be done. So, whatever payment is released, that is not released immediately. It waits for a certain number of more blocks to be added, so that there are many what we call confirmations of those transactions, and then only the payment is actually released. And similarly, for the block rewards that we have seen currently 6.25 bitcoins, that is not released immediately once that block is added to the network. As you can see, obviously that there could be a fork and only one of them die out. So, both of the miners cannot be paid those 6.25 bitcoins. So, typically there should be 100 confirmations of those blocks, only after that the block reward is actually handed over to the miner. So, these kinds of checks and balances are there, so that double spending is actually prevented. So, that is an important way by which you see that everything works in its own way. So, it is all self organizing. So, there is no central controller, but the protocol itself ensures that the entire network is robust against these types of possible attacks like double spending. Bitcoin anonymity, we have discussed that before, that it is permissionless and you do not need to set up any account. As we said, anybody can join, and also you may want to carry out anonymous transactions. So, that is why these Bitcoin addresses that are used for transactions, they are not directly the public keys, but the hashes of the public keys, and from there you cannot get back to the actual public key. Also, in case somebody tracks that, say person A, say Alice is using a particular address again and again. So, based on that, if somebody may try to see whether it is Alice who is making those kinds of payments based on some physical world information they have. So, typically what people do is that they do not use only a single public key and its hash to which the payment is made. They have a key ring of multiple such public keys, and they send, say, hash of public key number 1 to Alice for making a payment, hash of public key to Carol or for making a payment. So, the same person is actually remaining anonymous by distributing a number of public keys, and you can generate any number of public keys to different such pairs, so that they cannot also track that they are spending this money or paying to the same person, or who might again be sending it to others. So, from that trying to track this person. So, this Bitcoin address that is used for the transaction is not even the public key itself. Of course, it is not the IP address or anything, so that you would not be able to divulge the user's name or the user's identity. Also remember that we are talking about this public key and private key in this context. So, what the user needs to do is that create the private key, and once the private key is created, creating the public key can be done very easily. So, even the public key sometimes need not be stored, and the private key has to be stored in a secure manner by the user. So, that is what is important. So, these are these addresses, as we said, that it uses this generates the public key based on this ECDSA, the digital signature algorithm that is used in Bitcoin, and these are some of the Bitcoin address examples. We said the hashes, and you see that it is used using some form of encoding as is shown here. So, it is not again just those hex numbers. So, the hash of the public key shows something like this, which is sent from Bob to Alice to make the payment to. And as we said that each person can have many such addresses and each can have its own balance. Of course, each will have to have its own balance, because these payments are being made to a particular such public key hash. So, if Alice pays 10 bitcoins to one particular public key hash, say public key hash 1 of Bob, and then Carol makes some more payments of say 30 bitcoins to Bob to another public key hash, then of course, their balances would be different, and when Bob wants to pay, Bob will have to ensure that Bob pays individually from each of those addresses to which the payments were received. But Bob can receive in the same address some 10 bitcoins from Alice and then some 20 bitcoins from Carol, and then these 30 bitcoins he can combine to make a payment of 25 bitcoins to somebody else, say Tom, and then return those 5 bitcoins to himself. So, it is difficult to know which person owns what kind of amount. So, these are different ways by which one can ensure anonymity in the blockchain network. So, if we sum this part up, whatever we have discussed, that mind it that bitcoins do not really exist in that sense. Okay. So, this is very important, that there is nothing tangible or electronic object. So, there is nothing like a coin and you see its logo. So, but you cannot have a bitcoin of say 1 bitcoin purchased from somewhere. So, you do not actually get it like this, although always when you see bitcoin and the websites you see these types of coins. At some point in time a few coins were minted actually, but these are no longer there in circulation or in use, or they do not really exist. So, what you see here is that owning a bitcoin means what? It is simply that you have access to a key pair which includes a public key to which somebody else had sent some bitcoin, that is all it means, and for which you have a matching private key that gives you the authority to send the previously received bitcoin to another address. So, that means that you have received some bitcoin in your public key hash of it, and then using the script SIG you will be able to claim it, and you will be able to claim it only if you know the corresponding private key. And the last point is important, if you lose your private key, then you lose the corresponding bitcoins. Mind it that in the Bitcoin network there are a lot of bitcoins which have been lost because people lost their private keys or they passed away without sharing their private keys before their death and so on. So, those are completely lost, they are out of circulation, you cannot retrieve those. And actually loss of money due to double spending and all, it does not really occur in Bitcoin network, rather money is lost. I mean, people have lost their money just because they forgot their private key or they kept it somewhere and they are not able to locate it anymore and so on. So, that is what is very important, that one does not lose one's private key when they are going to deal with bitcoins in the Bitcoin network. Also, let us consider one more part. Suppose I own some bitcoins, and so far we have said as if we can only carry out transactions online and we get some service. We have not said what is that service that you get. So, Alice pays 50 bitcoins to Bob, and then why would Alice pay 50 bitcoins to Bob? Bob must have provided some service or sold something to Alice. So, how you can make the physical payment using Bitcoin? So, all that is needed is a private key or a set of private keys. So, if you are using multiple public keys for getting your bitcoins transferred to you, so you will have a set of private keys, and you can always generate, as I said, the public keys from the private keys at any point of time. And it is important, very important, that you safely store the private key. So, it could be stored in your desktop. I mean, if you store it on the web and somebody else gets it, then somebody else can claim it. So, there is nothing like your own claim on it other than your knowledge about the private key. So, if you are keeping it on the web on cloud somewhere, just make sure that nobody else can access it. You can keep it in your mobile phone, again you have to ensure that nobody can see it, and often that is why people do is that you can get special hardware where you can keep the private key and you can always carry it with you, which you can connect to your laptop or desktop when you are making the payment. Also, you could simply print it on a piece of paper as something like a QR code, and then if you are using your mobile phone. So, you may not be able to attach that physical hardware device to your mobile phone, but what you could do is that you could print your private key as a QR code, and then when suppose you go to a shop, a physical shopping, you go to any say departmental store, and suppose they allow payment by Bitcoin, you get your items, and then what you do is that when you are making the payment, you are carrying your mobile phone with a camera, and then you are carrying your QR code on a piece of paper and kept in your wallet. So, you take it out, you scan the QR code, which basically gets the private key, and then you make the payment using your Bitcoin, assuming that the departmental store also accepts payment in Bitcoin, and they will have their public key hash may be printed as a QR code. So, you first scan that, and then you know what is the destination address, you scan your private key from the piece of paper that you are carrying, and then you transfer the equivalent of Bitcoins for the items that you are purchasing, and then you are all set, it gets transferred. So, these are all assuming that the party is willing to accept payment through Bitcoin, the country is allowing payment through Bitcoins and so on, but if that is all considered that these are all allowed, then this is how you can simply carry out your payments. And as we just now mentioned that you could it could be as simple as paying using different other such mechanisms like Paytm, Google Pay and so on, which you are familiar with. And you could also pay it to your friends, like you transfer money over Paytm or Google Pay. You could also do the same thing, as long as you know the recipient's public key hash and you have not forgotten your own private key, you can make the payment. Finally, we will talk also a little bit about Bitcoin exchanges before we conclude today. Is that you have heard about these Bitcoin exchanges, and you might have heard about this notion of whether Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency is a valid currency in different countries, including in our own country India. And there are a lot of misconceptions, and there are legal issues, and there are different types of announcements have been made. So, you can follow those very carefully. So, there could be some countries where this payment using Bitcoin that may not be legal. That means that Bitcoin is not a legally valid currency for carrying out transactions, for making payments and so on, but it might be legal to trade Bitcoins. So, Bitcoin is actually now treated as a commodity, just as people can trade like their shares of companies, or they can trade say other currencies, like one can trade say dollar against Indian rupees, or dollar against euro, or euro against Indian rupees, or so many such combinations. So, one can do that. Similarly, one can also trade using Bitcoins, and you might have heard about these centralized exchanges in India. You see these different advertisements and so on, like WazirX and CoinDCX and so many others. So, it is just a list, nothing about which is good, which is bad, which is popular. There is no implication on that. It is just that some names have been put up here in this slide. And what they do is that when you create your accounts, they are like you create Demat accounts and all. So, similarly, they create accounts after verification of your KYC documents, and then they maintain your balance in Bitcoin, and they say that, oh, you can start with as low as 100 rupees or so. If you pay 100 rupees, you get only a few Satoshis and all. So, you get that, and then you have that in Bitcoin, and you are actually not creating a node in Bitcoin, you are not doing anything, you are just trading Bitcoin as a commodity. And then say you purchased Bitcoin when it was say one Bitcoin was some x amount of rupees, and now it is x plus delta x, and you are selling the same number of Bitcoins, you make that profit based on delta x and number of Bitcoins that you are selling. So, it is as simple as that. So, you can set your buying and selling prices in that exchange. These are digital, of course, exchange, but these are centralized exchange. And if required, you can say if you have earned some money through this trading process, you have earned say 1000 rupees, and now you can take it out. So, you can have that money transferred to your bank. or you can keep on trading. Sometimes what they do is that not maybe all these exchanges, not in all countries like India, but there could be other countries who can even let the participant, that is the user of that or the customer of that Bitcoin exchange, to take the money out in prepaid cards which are also anonymous. So, the entire process is kept anonymous, because if it's transferred to your bank account, then the centralized exchange knows that this money went to this particular person, this person was trading. But some countries might allow anonymous trading also, where it is not transferred to a particular bank account of an individual, but it is paid out in the form of, so paying out will be in a particular actual real currency from cryptocurrency. So, say in say dollar or euro, depending on what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is legal, what is not legal, what is valid, what is not valid, and so on. But based on that, technically it is possible that if somebody has earned 1 Bitcoin and 1 Bitcoin is say $5,000. So, this $5,000 could be transferred into a prepaid debit card, and then that particular user could make use of it in any departmental store. So, entire operation remains anonymous, and that is what is the last sub bullet in the second bulleted point. And also there could be some decentralized exchanges with appropriate procedures for handling similar requirements, because after all these Bitcoin and other blockchain networks are supposed to be completely decentralized in their operations. If you have these centralized exchanges, then this notion of decentralization goes. So, there are technical ways of actually implementing such decentralized exchanges, which is an important concept. So, but it has to be also ensured that if something goes wrong, to whom you can bank upon, so that you can recover your money. For centralized exchanges, the advantage could be that they would be responsible that if there is something wrong, that the system goes down where your transaction is actually being done, then you can fall back on them for any kind of support for recovering from the situation. For decentralized exchanges, which is technically feasible, but these issues are there, how to ensure that you can recover if there is something that went wrong. But of course, these are challenges, and also there are different ways by which people are trying to address those challenges. So, this is very important that we understand this whole set of operations for blockchains. Specifically, we discussed about Bitcoin in our these lectures on blockchain elements. To conclude today's lecture, we would like to say that we have understood the interesting concepts of how new coins are generated or mined as block rewards, how you started with 50 Bitcoins for block number 0, and how everything has been designed in a way that over a period of time the difficulty level is adjusted, how based on that also the reward is adjusted, so that there is not an inflow of a very large number of Bitcoins in circulation. So, that is adjusted in 2140, that the number of Bitcoins mined will come to almost 0, means that there will be no block reward, and the only reward would be through these transactions that are being included in the blocks. So, those who are carrying out transactions will have to possibly pay a bit more to attract the miners. And we have also talked about how double spending is handled in Bitcoin network, and anonymity in Bitcoin, as we said, that it is pay to public key hash. One can have multiple public key private key pairs, and the payments could be to different such public keys, which is very interesting. And of course, you will be able to pay using Bitcoin, as we have seen the physical service or product purchase that you do, depending on the laws that are valid in different countries, including our country. You may or may not be allowed to actually carry out such transactions, but if you are allowed, then using your Bitcoins to make payments would simply mean that you have to remember your private key, and you have to get the public key hash to which you have to make the payment. The rest will be as simple as just scanning the target public key hash, and also using your private key to make the payment. And also, you have seen the role of exchanges, what is meant by trading of Bitcoin. So, that is different from actually carrying out transactions in the Bitcoin network or doing this process of mining of blocks in the Bitcoin network. It is completely different, where you can simply load some money in your account with the Bitcoin exchange, who will of course carry out necessary checks like KYC checks and all, and then you are trading the Bitcoins. If you feel that the prices are going to go up, you hold on to it, and then you maybe sell or you buy, and all those things. These are your choices, and these are typically centralized exchanges, and there could always be also decentralized exchanges. And these are again the references that we have been referring to, and there are many such different websites also where we get a lot of additional information. You can visit their wiki pages and these different exchanges. You can also go through their sites and get to see what kind of services they provide. So, that brings us to the end of this particular topic, which is blockchain elements, and also to the end of this lecture, and thank you very much for your attention.